Today, we're happy to have longtime Society member and chairman of the Society's Historic Preservation Board, Mr. Bill Martin, here to give some architectural insights into our historic homes. Among his many achievements are his recent appointment to Bergen County Historic Preservation Advisory Board, receipt of a Top 10 Merit Award from the New Jersey chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and receipt of Bergen County's 2008 Historic Preservation Commendation Award as an excellent example of historic preservation effort in rehabilitating the 1908 Perry and Jewelers building in Westwood, formerly Westwood's First National Bank. In private practice for over 20 years, Bill received his certified LEED, APH, professional credential in 2010, a member of Westwood Zoning Board and Adjustment since 1993, and the Planning Board since 1996. He has served as chairman of the Zoning Board since 1995. A resident of Westwood for many years, Bill is the husband of one of our current co-vice presidents, the lady standing in the back who provided all the goodies, Ms. Jackie Martin. As the proud daughter of two talented high school girls, one of whom is here today, Abby. And Grace is backstage preparing for an upcoming play, right? So it's indeed an honor and a privilege to turn the rest of the afternoon program over to Bill Martin.
Okay, hope everyone can hear me. I developed a little bit of a cold on Friday, so I'm just starting to get over it now, so I apologize, I'm a little scratchy. But just to dovetail a little bit onto what George said, any of you here who are not members of the Society should take a look in the museum. There are artifacts in that museum that is maintained by this volunteer group. There are artifacts in that museum that exist nowhere else in the world. There's a wampum drilling machine that was used to make wampum that became a form of currency for the Indians. There are Revolutionary War artifacts that were unearthed from the towns in the Pascack Valley. There are things in that museum that are absolutely fascinating, and it would be wonderful. I've been a member here for at least 15 years. My wife, my daughters volunteer. It's a wonderful experience. It really connects you with the community. It really makes you understand what it's like to live in the Pascack Valley. So I would suggest, to anyone, become involved with the Society, become a member, and help support it financially. There's a lot of really good stuff here. You can't hear me back there? All right, I'll try. You all heard that, right? I don't want to repeat it. All right. The title of what I'm going to discuss, it's called A Simple History of Home Construction in the Pascack Valley, Part 1. I called it Part 1 partly because I don't know exactly how far I'm going to get with this today. But we'll see. We'll see. So what I'm going to do here is, let's move to the next slide. All right. This is a map, and I know you can't really see it here, of the Township of Washington, which encompasses the 8 towns of the Pascack Valley before it was divided up into individual towns. By the way, the Society has many maps. There's an 1861 map here. In the library, there are maps of old maps of all parts of the Pascack Valley. But my point in showing this is, I know it's hard to see here. Let me try this way. But these dots with words next to them represent individual houses and individual property owners' names. So this map is 1880. So there's a map that shows the entirety of the Pascack Valley with all the names of all the people who owned all the houses. My point in showing this is that there weren't really a lot of people around here. It wasn't populated like it is today. In fact, the population, let's go back a little bit. If you go back to 1850, okay, and that's before the rail line was here. In 1850, the population of Bergen County, the entire county, was 14,684 people. That's the whole of Bergen County. To give you some idea of what that means is our Pascack Valley town of Hillsdale if anyone's here from Hillsdale, has about 15,000 residents right now. So the entirety of Bergen County was less than what you have right now just living in one town. And it's sparsely populated. And in fact, if you go back to 1840, between 1840 and 1850, Bergen County only added a little over 1,000 residents. In 10 years, it was only 1,000 more people. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because I've been searching for maps prior to, let's say, 1860 or 1850 of this area, and it's very hard to find them. And I finally had someone say to me, there wasn't anybody here. There was no reason to map it because there's nobody here. So I stopped looking. But you can still find maps of Bergen County that go back earlier that do identify some of these areas. The reason why that's important is because in 1870, the rail line, the train line, was extended from Hackensack up through into the Pascack Valley. Once the rail line was extended, that opened the door for materials and people to be able to travel into this area. Now this map happens to be 1880, so you would see a little bit of an increase. But that rail line being extended allowed for a lot of construction materials that used to have to be produced locally could now be produced elsewhere and brought in by train. So you have developing the first building supplies. Before that, you had general stores, and they had basic construction materials in the general stores. They had mortar, they had some lumber, and they had tools and things like that. But now, once the rail line comes in, you can see materials coming in that, like brick that is fired, concrete blocks that are cast, can now be brought in on rail and be purchased and brought to a construction site, and things can be constructed. So the rail line made a huge difference. And just by comparison, Ridgewood, if I'm not mistaken, got their rail line extension in the 1850s. It was just before the Civil War, and Westwood and the Pascack Valley got their rail line in 1870. And if you go into Ridgewood, you'll notice that the old buildings in Ridgewood date from that period. That's when they built a lot of those main buildings. They date from prior to 1860. And if you look at Westwood, you see a similar occurrence. You see a lot of the buildings that were built in the town, and I'm going to get to house construction in a minute, date from when the rail line came in. The rail line also allowed people to travel from the Pascack Valley to the population centers in New Jersey and then across the river and into New York. You could travel from Westwood or Hillsdale. You could go down to Hoboken. You could take a ferry into New York. You could get on a steamship and go anywhere in the world. So now you had situations where people could travel to Paris, to London, and come back and bring back with them the ideas and the forms and the architecture and the things that they saw. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to flip through some of the styles that are prevalent in the Pascack Valley before I get into the nuts and bolts of home construction. Okay, this is a Second Empire style. This house is actually on Washington Avenue in Westwood. It was recently restored. It's a beautiful example of the Second Empire style. And the Second Empire style relates back to what was occurring in France in the 1870s with Napoleon III. They had fires. They had buildings very tightly packed in Paris, and they had some major fires. So the government at the time, under Napoleon III, decided to clear out a lot of what they would call slums, and they created these beautiful grand boulevards, grand avenues that you see in Paris today. That also gave them a chance to modernize the city. They adopted new architecture, the roof styles, the dormer styles, and such that you see here in Westwood come from France in the 1870s. Now here, this house is built probably about 1884, maybe as late as 1890. But this is all because of the rail line, allowing that the flow of people, flow of information, and the flow of materials.
Is that owned privately?
This house is owned commercially. Right next door, there's a brand new bank that was constructed, so it's a credit union. But the house, the zoning board requested that the house be preserved in perpetuity, so that, and it's the responsibility of the bank to make sure that it does, so there's no taxpayer dollars required. It will remain there, and it will remain in good condition from here on, which we're very pleased about. Here we see, this house is actually in Oradell, but this style is very prevalent in the Pascack Valley. This is a Queen Anne Victorian. You see the porch, you see the gingerbread, you see the railings, you see the different sized dormers, the rail at the front dormer. You see there's a lot of detail put into these houses. These houses were built all throughout the Pascack Valley. A lot of them were built by the railroad, very close to the rail line, to house workers who were then living there and extending the railroad. Not all of them were this ornate. Some of them were simpler. And of course, sometimes you see a mixture of styles based on individual preferences. This is an American Foursquare. Now we're getting closer to 1900. This house dates from about 1895. This was, they call it an American Foursquare because it's essentially a square plan, perfect square, and it's divided into 4 rooms, and on both floors. So there are variations of this as well. This particular house has a wraparound porch on the south side and on the west side to keep the sun off the house in summer. And that's, you'll see these around. You'll see sometimes they have prominent bays, sometimes they have dormers, sometimes they don't have dormers. You see them a lot around the Pascack Valley.
What town is that in?
This house is in Westwood. This house is at the corner of Fairview Avenue and Lake Street in Westwood.
So there are only 4 rooms on each floor?
That's the way these houses were built. In some cases, the Sears catalog came into play at this point. I don't know how you're familiar with the Sears catalog. You could actually buy a house from Sears, and because of the rail line, you could have it delivered to you. American Foursquares were in the Sears catalog, along with some others that I'm going to go into. This house, however, was not a kit, not a Sears house.
What did you say about the sun in the summer?
On this house, there's a wide porch on 2 sides. The 2 sides that the porch is on is the southern side and the western side. In the summer, that's where the hottest part of the day heats up the house. So by having a wide porch, open porch, on those 2 sides, the house stays cool even now on the hottest days in the summer because it keeps the sun off the house. This is more of a bungalow style. This actually is a Sears kit house. This house is in Hillsdale, and essentially a bungalow house is almost like a railroad flat, if you're familiar with that term. It's rooms with rooms with rooms, and you kind of walk through one room to get to the other as you go to the back. A lot of these were built as kit homes. A lot of these were built as vacation homes. There were bungalow colonies, bungalow groupings of these homes in many Pascack Valley towns. And with the rail line, you could live in New York and work in New York, but you could send your family to the Pascack Valley in the summers, and they could come in summer in the country, and you could join them on the weekends and go back to work on the rail line on Monday. So it made for an adjustment in lifestyle, and it kind of opened the gateway for people from New York and from Jersey City, from the waterfront area where a lot of the commerce was occurring, to be able to come up into the Pascack Valley and enjoy it and either settle there or maybe partly settle there. So a lot of bungalow homes were built at that particular.
Where is that located?
This house is on Everdell
Oh,
in Hillsdale. Excuse me, I'm getting some water. You'll see it has a fireplace, and there's some small windows. At one time, I believe that those were stained glass windows. If you go in, there's some detail around. A lot of them had chestnut moldings, and these came with the kit. If you go in the basement, you can see, A connects to B. It's like Tinker Toys. But it's a very simple foundation. In this case, it was a stone foundation. It's in very good condition. It doesn't look like this today, though. It was expanded. There was an addition put on this house. And a lot of these photos that I'm showing you are coming from my own personal archives, as I've been in hundreds, if not thousands, of houses in the Pascack Valley. The next style is what I call an arts and crafts, a craftsman style house. This is a little older. This is maybe teens, 20s into the 30s. Here you see a house that's got a second floor on it. It's got a lot of the qualities of a bungalow, but with the second floor, you now have bedrooms upstairs. You have a little more living space. You have the indoor plumbing, and you have something that you can live in all year round, not just as a summer home or a vacation home if you wanted to. Then we have the old standard Cape Cod. A lot of homes in Long Island were built as Cape Cods. Levittown, almost the entire area is built with Cape Cods. Some were built in the 30s. A lot of them were built after World War II. When the soldiers came home, they needed houses. There was a big housing shortage. People were building like crazy. They were also building here in the Pascack Valley for the same reason. This is when you start to see, after World War II, you start to see these enormous subdivisions with identical houses being built, one next to the other. People didn't do that before World War II, at least not to that extent. Here you see a typical ranch. Ranch is one story. It's a living room, kitchen, dining room, and usually 2 or 3 bedrooms. This one has an attached garage. This house is in Washington Township. You don't see a lot of ranches left in Bergen County because the land is now so expensive. We reached a milestone in Bergen County in the Pascack Valley. I can tell you that in May of 1997 is when most of the houses on the land became worth less than the land itself. So once that happens, there are things that occur such as knockdowns, McMansions, because it's not the house that's valued anymore, it's the land. And that drives a lot of what you see around us when you see these McMansions going up. It's all about the economics of how expensive the land is. So you don't see a lot of ranches because if you don't build 2 stories, you're not getting enough use out of the land because the land is the expensive part. So a lot of these homes had levels added onto them. And there were a lot of homes in Pascack Valley that were built in all styles that eventually had added levels put onto them. Okay, here's our split level. This house is in Montvale. It's a standard split level where you enter into the middle level and you have living at a half level below and a half level above. This was the state-of-the-art in home design after World War II. Split levels were going to save everyone from colonials because with the colonial you had to walk up all those stairs to get to the second floor. So they were marketed as smart. They were marketed as the wave of the future. They're starting to come back now. I know a lot of people did not like, decided they didn't like it. I mean, look, these trends ebb and flow over time. A lot of them were built after World War II. I grew up in one very similar to this, the 1-car garage, 3 bedrooms. Sometimes it had a bath and a half. Sometimes it had only 1 bath. People raised entire families in these. A lot of people expand these also. But you see this house a lot in multiple subdivisions where every house is the same, or sometimes they'll turn the roof or something. So there's our split level. And now we're getting into the 40s, 50s. Here's another split level. This split level happens to be in Hillsdale on Elm Road. And then here we have, this is something that I believe is somewhat unique to the Pascack Valley. We have these Saddle Ranch Tandy and Allen houses. I don't know if anyone's from Hillsdale, you'd be familiar with this style of home. Again, command performance. You see there's a lot of enthusiasm with the marketing of these houses. This was state-of-the-art living at the time. And they built hundreds of them right next to each other. And people thought it was the greatest thing in the world. I mean, at the time, it was. They were new. It was a different design. People didn't live in split levels. This is, it had some modern details to it. This is what attracted people. They wanted new. This is in an era when people bought a new car every 2 years. Nobody had an old car. Everybody had new cars. You went, you bought one new one every 2 years. So new and better was everything back in the 50s, 60s. And then we get into, okay, now here's another hybrid. This is a bi-level. This is where the first floor is on a slab and the second floor is above. You enter in a split entry where you have stairs going down and stairs going up. Typically, you have the kitchen, living room, dining room on the second floor with 3 bedrooms. And then at the basement level, you have the 2-car garage, and there was a family room and the utilities, laundry room and such. Another hybrid. You started to see these in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Again, they built a lot of them. And here's our typical center, all colonial, symmetrical design, except for the garage in this case. You enter into the front door, and you see a big staircase in front of you. And on your left is the dining room. On your right is the living room with a fireplace. Behind the dining room is the kitchen. Behind the living room is sometimes a family room, sometimes not. You go upstairs, you got 3 to 4 bedrooms, usually 2 baths, things like that. And then from there, and I don't have photos of that, but we go from here to contemporary design in the 80s, where you had these long sloping roofs, very modern, very contemporary feeling, and those were popular for a while. A lot of those got built after the oil crisis. And instead of spending the money on making the house look pretty on the outside, they spent the money on building them to be more energy efficient. Now, they did not build them to the standards we're building them now. Now, this is only 20, 25 years later. We're building them much higher standards now. But they put money into that, and that was the hook there when they were building those homes. It's modern, new, energy efficient, and then after 1973, the gas lines, and then again in 1977, people worried about heating oil, they were worried about natural gas costs, and that was a lot of the modern houses. And then after that, we see kind of, a return of a lot of details, and that you have this stucco material that they put on these McMansion houses where they can make any kind of shape they want. It's not expensive. You see a return to this kind of overly detailed, overly expressed architecture, and that brings us up to today with that. Now this last slide, this is actually the Oradell house that I showed you, and I think in the second slide, but now it's been restored with modern materials. It's been insulated with modern materials, and it'll be around for another 100 years plus. But I'm going to back up to, let's back up to that. All right, now that stylistically brings you from about, sure.
What about the sugar maple split? What that?
Well, that's an offshoot of a split level. Split level is a main style, and then there's different decorative styles. The sugar maple split. You see that this Tandy and Saddle Ranch style that they call it. There were all kinds of variations depending on where they were being built, depending on what builder was doing it, and what he thought his market was. It's all about, marketing the house. A lot of them were built by builders with the intent to sell. They weren't building them to live in them themselves. So they would make little changes in order to differentiate them. Some of them had wood siding. Some of them had aluminum siding. Some of them had clapboard siding. There were differences that way. Some of them had vertical siding. Some of these Tandy and Allens had the vertical siding. So the names like Sugar Maple Split and some of these other names, they're more real estate terms than they are architectural style terms. Yes?
Do you think the Saddle Ranch designation is more of a real estate term, and it's really just like a ranch house?
Well, I'm reading it off of the marketing materials from 1949. But I would consider it a form of a split level home. But just to continue, I was going to go back now and discuss how things changed in construction over the years since from pre-Civil War to now. First thing you have to do when you build a house is you got to dig a foundation. Prior to 1870, when the rail line was here, that foundation had to be dug by hand. Next problem you run into is what do you use for foundation materials? Now remember, back in 1850, 1860, there weren't a lot of people around here. They would go, after they hired people to dig, they would dig the trenches. They had to dig them down at least 3 foot into the ground, 3 or 4 feet. They'd go to the nearest watercourse, nearest brook. There are a lot of brooks that feed into the major streams. They're not all on the map. Some of them have dried up. And they would harvest out of those brooks pebble stone, the smooth pebbles, maybe about this big, and they would use that as a footing. Because they did not have concrete trucks that would show up and pour by picking up the phone and calling. They'd lay the pebble stones in the bottom of the trench on undisturbed soil, Over that, from the general store, they would get some mortar, cement mix mortar, and they would lay and trowel a flat and level base, and that was the footing. The pebble stones have a property where they link up into a matrix as you put weight on them, and then that load would be spread into the ground. I have been in a lot of houses, and people get very alarmed when they find out that they do not have a footing under their foundation, but it's perfectly fine. These things will last. It was a good way to build. It was the only way to build at the time. In terms of foundation, once the rail line came in, there was access to brick. There was access to more concrete-type materials. And then later on, as you got into the 1880s, 1890s, and the turn of the century, concrete block. And you'll notice, and these materials are very heavy, so it's not the kind of thing, it's not like you're going to take your horse and cart and go down a Hackensack and lug enough bricks up the Pascack Valley to be able to build a foundation. So these materials coming in on the train, that was a huge improvement. You also will notice as you look at the old maps and you see the development patterns that the houses were built as close to the rail line as people could manage because that minimized the distance. And you'll see it's been in a lot of the towns in New Jersey, the rail lines really spurred a lot of the development. So construction materials being available, such as brick, and there are a lot of houses with brick foundations. And then the concrete block, sometimes you see it's got rusticated surface. It kind of looks like it's bulging out. It looks like, almost looks like a shaped stone. But that was a cast concrete block. They built a lot of foundations out of that. And then, of course, regular concrete block, which we use even today. So that's what happened with the foundations in terms of how things changed once the rail line came in. Next, I want to talk about the framings, the wood framing the houses were actually made from. And the rail line had an effect on this as well. Prior to the rail line being in, you would, if you wanted to build a house, and a lot of the need, remember there weren't a lot of people there, a lot of the need to build a house came from expanding families. You had a farmer who had any number of acres, he would carve off a piece and give to his daughter who's marrying the young man from the next family, and they would need to build a house there. They'd go to the property, they would cut the trees down on the property. They would cut them and trim them down by hand, then they would tie them into bundles, and they would let them sit there for 2 years at least to dry out. Once they dried out, they could be then sawn up into lumber that they could then build a house from. And this happened all over Bergen County before the rail. So they would cut them up into studs, and a lot of these trees, some of these trees that they cut and cut into lumber for houses were 100, 200 years old. So it wasn't like you were going to go plant another tree and then in a few years you were going to be able to have more wood. So they cut these trees down, and that's how they did it. They would cut studs for the walls that were very long. Because these were old trees, they were tall. So as they cut the lumber down, they could make studs that were 2 stories high or even higher. So they would frame the house on top of the foundation, put the wood floor joists, which in some cases were rough hewn, and they would set the floor joists in place, and then they would put the wall studs next to the floor joists. It's all sitting on the raw foundation. There's no plate on the foundation or anything. It's right on there. You have a question?
What species of trees would
They would use all kinds of species. They would use cedar. They love cedar because it has natural preservative properties. But a lot of the pine, the yellow pine. I know a lot of people think that pine is a softwood, but yellow pine is very hard. It's a great lumber to use. And of course, there's Douglas fir, and there's other natural species that they would use and cut up, and they would mix them together. I believe they did. Yeah, those trees are particularly straight. They're very straight, and they have deep taproots too.
Question.
Yeah.
How did they cut the lumber? Did they have machinery?
They did have machinery that was, well, they used a lot of hand tools, let me put it that way. Depended on where you were. If you were near a town that had a sawmill, and you could get the lumber there, you could have a sawmill that was powered by water, or in some cases by animals. But, so my point about the long studs is the long studs allow for a framing method called balloon framing. A balloon framing runs the stud from the foundation all the way up to the attic. The problem with balloon framing is that it makes a very nice, beautiful house, and it's easy to build, it's square, and it's wonderful to work with. But if there's a fire down below, it goes up into the space between the studs and runs all the way to the roof, and then the house burns from the roof down very quickly. So that was a problem. That's what burned when Chicago burned. A lot of the buildings were balloon framed. So what you started to see, for a number of reasons, after the rail line came in, you saw that you didn't have to cut the trees down and wait 2 years. Lumber could come in from other parts of the country by rail. It was already cut. That you could still, and they were still cutting very long studs. Even in the 1870s, they were still building balloon framing. They built balloon framing right up and past the turn of the century, until the building codes, started to outlaw it. But what you started to see with the rail lines and with the lumber industry is that the shorter studs were easier to transport. So a form of framing that developed out of fire danger and out of the necessity of commerce is called Western platform framing. The difference is that the studs do not go from the foundation all the way to the roof. There's a platform constructed on the foundation, and on top of that is a frame wall system, and then above that, and it only goes to the top of the first floor. And then the second floor platform is framed, and then the second floor is framed above that. And what that does is it interrupts the stud space from the basement to the attic. They also, now this is before they really insulated houses, they would also put what is called a fire blocking in, which is an additional stud that ran horizontal about halfway up the wall. And that would be a barrier for fire if it got in. The idea wasn't to build it so that it couldn't burn. The idea was to slow down the fire, to give people time to get help to put the fire out. That was the idea. Because you built with wood was a flammable material, and it was a constant danger. So if you could slow down the fire, you could save your house. So that was the effect and the change in the lumber. The next part I would talk about is, let's see. Well, let's talk about the finishing a little bit. Inside, we had wood flooring, and again, for the same reason the framing was done, we had the wood flooring a lot of times was locally produced. It was produced in a similar way as the framing lumber, but it was produced, it had a neater finish, it was more finished, so when you put it in your house, it looked nicer. And you still see these wide plank floors from time to time, and I have clients even ask me now for the wide plank floors. And it's hard. These wide plank floors were cut from old growth lumber, which had very tight grains. Some of these trees were 200 years old when they were harvested. If you're going to make new wide plank flooring, you're going to make it out of new trees. The new trees are genetically engineered and bred between different species to grow fast. Because if they grow fast, they can cut them into building lumber, send them to where they got to go, and then they can plant the next field over with new trees, and they know in 10 years they'll be able to come back and harvest those trees. That's how fast they grow, incredibly fast. So now they're not cutting every, and this is why we still have trees, because otherwise there would be no trees left. They'd cut all the trees down, and we would have lots of houses and no trees, which is what happened in Europe. So that's the hardwood flooring, and then of course you had interior finished materials. The interior materials were plaster and lath, and that didn't change too much. Plaster was available, and you mix up the plaster, and then it was usually applied 3 coats over a wood lath, which was a small piece of wood that was nailed between the studs, and you would squish the plaster through, and it would grab onto those wooden slats. And that would be a rough coat, and then you would have a finish coat. And if you had more money, you'd have a 3rd coat put on, which would give you a very nice smooth finish, which would make for a very nice house. Now remember, this is plaster. It's not like we have sheetrock today. Plaster would go on. It's a messy process. And it's hard to get good edges. So that's why you see wide base at the floor. The tall, wide, thick wood base to transition between the wall and the floor is because the plaster work, they could not make the plaster work come all the way down to the floor and be neatly done. So they would do the plaster work and then they would cover it with that mold. You also see that at the ceilings. A lot of times there'll be a wide crown. Could be a simple crown, it could be a complicated crown, depends on how you design it. But that is why these moldings exist. They exist in order to make these transitions work for the interior design of the house. In some houses from the 20s and 30s, you'll see a very small mold, and the mold has a rounded top on it. It looks like a picture rail mold, if you know what a picture rail is. And they used to put that up within about an eighth of an inch of the top. There's a little space above it, but that was designed to hide that joint as it met the ceiling, because crack always developed there, and it was just very labor-intensive and time-consuming to get that joint perfect. So that's why they did that. And they used that particular shape because styles had changed and people wanted a thinner molding. So that's how they did it. And of course, people that had enough money to have the plasterers do that kind of meticulous work, the wealthier people had homes that had little or no molding at all, and people recognized, oh, you must have money, you didn't need a molding there. But with the Latin plaster wall, you can't go around knocking holes and hanging pictures. So what they would do is they would put a molding in above, usually aligned with the tops of the doors, went around the rooms, especially in the public parts of the house. It was a mold attached to the wall, was rounded on top. That was a picture rail. If you go to the museums, you can see they still do this a lot of times with artwork. They'll hang a hook on the rail and drop a metal cord down, and that way you didn't have to drive nails in the walls and mess up the plaster, destroy the plaster. Because when and I've done this myself in my house because I have Latin plaster, you're going to hang a picture, you put a nail in, you go to hammer it, and you can hear the plaster falling down inside the walls. So that is why they put picture rail up. And then, of course, there's chair rail, which went up about 2.5 feet from the floor. And that was put primarily in kitchens and dining spaces. So as chairs were backed up to the wall, they wouldn't damage the plaster. So these moldings all have, there's stylistic reasons as to why people wanted them, but they have very important functions in order to preserve the Latin plaster. Now, Latin plaster was used extensively right up through the turn of the century, and then we started to see hybrids. After World War II, you started to see what they call rock lath. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. Instead of the wood lath to hold the plaster in place, they would have this gypsum board. It looked just like wallboard. It was about 14 or 15 inch wide planks. They would put that across the wall, and it had holes in it. And the holes would grab the plaster as the plasterers came in. Now, the reason why they did this is because they had sheetrock. They had developed a mechanized way of turning gypsum into boards to make interior walls. But there was great concern that the plasterers union, which was a very powerful construction union, those people could be put out of business within a few years. So, like most governments, they outlawed sheetrock, and they claimed it was fire, danger, and it was always, they made all kinds of claims that it was unsafe and stuff. And of course, the plasterers union was, you need to have plasterers. You can't do it. So they developed a rock lath, which was kind of a hybrid between the two, and they used that for about 10 years or so while the construction industry adjusted. And then, now what you see in homes is the sheetrock, the wallboard, gypsum board, whatever you want to call it. It has essentially the same properties as the plaster, and that property is due to the gypsum. And gypsum is a mineral. It's a very soft mineral, but it's mixed and it's squeezed and it's formed into panels, and it is fire resistant. And that's why people used plaster and then gypsum board, and this is why we use it today. The way it works is if there's a fire in a room, as the heat starts to heat up that gypsum board, the gypsum has a chemical reaction occurs in the gypsum that releases water as a result of the heat. That water is released to the surface of the gypsum board. So that water takes the heat of the fire away. Again, it doesn't stop the fire, but it slows it down. It can slow it down, depending on the extent of the fire, up to about an hour. So that it's this chemical reaction that occurs within the gypsum wallboard, and it also occurred in gypsum plaster, which is why these things were used in construction. And of course, the rail line makes it easy to bring these gypsum panels in, and that's how they were, and that's why they were using them in homes. Let's see. Explain the moments. Okay, let's talk a little bit about windows. Okay. If you go back to the colonial era, this is well before 1850, glass, window glass was very expensive. And the reason why it was expensive is there were no glass factories on this side of the Atlantic. Glass had to be shipped. And of course, after a while they started making glass factories and started doing it. But because of that, the glass had to be cut into very small pieces. Because if you try to transport a large piece of glass, there's a very good chance it's not going to make it to its destination. So you see a lot of colonial era homes had small windows with lots of small panes in them. And I know this because when I went to Thomas Jefferson's home in Monticello, he 3 times ordered a piece of glass from Europe to fill an ocular, which is an opening in the ceiling of a room. It was a large skylight. It was a round opening. And he ordered 3 of them, and each time they arrived broken. So the last one arrived cracked but not broken, and that's the one that they ended up installing. But it was very difficult to transport glass. So by the 1850s, they were making glass here in the U.S., but they still had the issue of transport. Again, you're not talking about the train, and the train is a very smooth ride. Horse and cart's not such a smooth ride. So you still had the smaller glass panes, but they were bigger because you didn't have to travel as far. What you saw in a lot of homes in the Pascack Valley, and a lot of the homes that I showed you here, is you'll have what we call an 8/1 or a 6/1, where they have 6 small panes or 8 small panes over the 1 large pane. And the idea behind that was smaller panes were less expensive, so you put them in the upper sash. The larger pane was more expensive, and that's where you wanted to look out from. So that's how you ended up with that. And of course, before we had machinery and factories making windows, carpenters made windows. They had hand tools. They made the muntins that separated the glass. They used a putty to attach the glass panels. And they made these windows with the sash weights and the chain, and that allowed for the opening and closing of the window. Now, a lot of the windows were double-hung windows. Now, a lot of homes today have double-hung windows. You also have casing windows, awning windows, hopper windows. They have a lot of these same style windows. But the reason why double-hung windows were particularly useful in a house is if you're in 1850 or 1860 Pascack Valley, you don't have air conditioning. Windows were the way that you ventilated your house. And before I get to the reason why it's important with the double hung, let me just also say that they would also plant deciduous trees. Deciduous trees are trees that lose their leaves. They would plant those trees on the south side and across the west. On the north, they would plant pine trees or conifer trees near the house. The reason they did that is in the summer when the leaves are in bloom, they shade the house, so the sun wasn't shining on the house. Porches also would, the whole idea behind a porch was also driven by this. The early Dutch houses, the front of the houses were made with stone, the rest of the sides were not, but they always faced south and they always had a wide porch on them. And that's why. Because the wide porch kept the sun off the house for the Dutch settlers, and the stone stayed cool, and it would help the house stay cool. In the winter, the sun angle becomes lower. In the winter, the trees lose their leaves, the sun shines on the stone, because the porch doesn't block that when it's lower, heats up the stone, and the houses are warmer in the winter. Now with the older houses, the porch idea still works. A lot of them didn't have the stone, but you planted the conifers on the north side, and that kept the wind on the north side, which is the cold side. In the winter, that kept the wind down, because you couldn't seal the house up the way you do today. So there were these strategies that they used that everyone knew about. People were very connected to nature. Back then, we're so pulled back from nature right now. I wonder if anyone of you looks up at the stars anymore. But the moon phases, the sun, all of these things were very important. It could be a matter of life and death in some cases to people. So these strategies were employed in order for people to live comfortably, and they did live comfortably. Believe it or not, you don't need air conditioning and central heating necessarily to live comfortably at this latitude. But back to the windows. The nice thing about a double-hung window is that you can open the top sash as well as the bottom. Now, I know a lot of the older windows are painted shut. My windows are painted shut. I can't get them open. But you want to open the top sash in the summers because it lets the hot air out of the room. If you only open the bottom sash, the whole room has to get hot before that air flows out. So they would open the top sash in these windows a lot. That's why double-hung windows were put in a lot of homes. So there's reasons, there's functional reasons for all of these things that we refer to now as stylistic things. So that's my spiel about the windows. That and the saving money with the size of the glass. And of course, windows had to be much more precisely made than framing lumber. It couldn't be just chipped away with an axe. It had to be finished. And they had hand tools that were every bit as good as the machines they use today. And tools were passed down from father to son. These tools were important, and they could cut straight beads to create these window pieces, and then they would assemble them. And there were window factories all around. Windows were lighter. They could be transported more easily. They were less dependent on the rail. But of course, windows would eventually come in on the rail also. So that's about windows and about the general environment. Now let's talk about power and fire. And I don't mean fire in burning it down. I mean fire in terms of keeping warm. Earlier in the 1800s, you would have fireplaces that would keep you warm by radiant heat. By radiant, I mean it's the warmth of the fire that you feel. It's not the heating of the air. We have forced air, hot air systems now. The air is heated. That air is distributed to the house. It wasn't like that with a fire. With a fire, you only were warm when you were in front of the fire. If you walked into the hall, it was freezing cold. And the houses very often, with the fireplaces as their only heating, would be as cold inside as the outside air. And that's why people dressed warmly in the winter. And they put layers on. And if you look at old paintings of the depictions of people dressed from the period, you'll see that they look like they're going to suffocate. But the other action of a fireplace is as the draft of the smoke goes up the chimney, it draws air in from outside. So there's no way to combat this. You've got cold air in your house in the winter, and you just live with it. Yeah, you warmed. Well, they didn't suffer. They warmed themselves by the fire, and then they put layers of clothes on, and that's how they lived. Then we get a little further along, and now we start to see things like furnaces, wood burning and coal burning. Stoves, wood burning and coal burning, various appliances. There were coal works in the Pascack Valley. People bought coal and used it in their furnaces. In the older homes, if they didn't already have the basement dug out, they would dig out a section of the basement, and in there they would put a coal furnace or a coal stove of some kind, and they would have grates in the floors. And the grate would allow the heat from the furnace in the basement. That heat would then rise through the floors by natural convection to heat the various rooms in the house. And that it's not a very efficient way of heating, but it does work. And it does take you from, let's say, if it's 32 degrees outside, it'll take the inside of your house from 32 maybe up into the 50s. And of course, if you're burning wood, you're burning a lot of wood. If you're burning coal, you're burning less coal, but you still have to be careful because you don't want to burn your house down. Then, of course, we came into natural gas, and then we have different heating system types like steam. The way a steam system works is attached to a boiler. The boiler is fired either by coal, wood, or by natural gas. It heats the water up to boiling. That steam rises through the pipes just by the pressure of the steam. When it reaches the radiators, it comes into a space that's larger than the pipe. When it does that, it condenses back into water. When it condenses from steam into water, it releases what they call the latent heat of steam. That heat then is transferred to the metal radiator and is radiated out to the room. And it's actually, a radiator is a misnomer. It is radiant like a fire, but it's really the action of the air flowing along the fins that heated the air. So that's how steam worked. There were single pipe steam systems where the steam would rise and then drain back down through the same pipes. There were also two pipe systems where the steam would rise through one pipe and then return to the boiler through another. My house, and I love my steam, I have a single pipe steam system. I love it. I know it's getting near the end of its lifespan, but I love the steam. I love the clanking. It's the house is talking to me. So then we move from steam heat, and we don't really do new steam systems anymore. It's more hot water, and you have a boiler, and you have zone valves, and you run tubing, and they have thin tube convectors, which some people call radiators, but they're not radiators. The heat is released from the water through the fins of the tube and not through the latent transfer of heat from the steam condensing to water. That's the big difference there. But it's an efficient form of heating, and that those boilers can be very small in size and be very efficient. And then, of course, you have forced air, which is a furnace, which uses some form of a fuel to heat air, and then you need a fan system to distribute that air through. In order to have a fan system, you really need some kind of a mechanical device, which then needs electrical power. So that's heating systems. Then let's talk a minute about electrical power. There wasn't always electricity around here. There was a big debate in the late 1800s about electric power and whether it was safe and whether it was useful at all. Houses were built very often with gas lines to sconces and to ceiling fixtures, and they would be lit, fire burning in the fixture. And prior to that, it was oil lamps. It was whale oil lamps, and that's how they had light at night, and that's how they had lighting in the houses. When electricity came along, first New York City was lit, and Thomas Edison had a big hand in that. The big debate about electricity was between Edison and Nikola Tesla as to whether AC, alternating current, or whether DC, direct current, would be what you would use. Now, Edison was a very shrewd businessman. He went on tours all around the country promoting DC, direct current. And he would have these elaborate shows where he would round up local stray cats and he would electrocute them with alternating current to demonstrate how dangerous alternating current was. Now, it's horrible that they would do that, but this is what they did in their traveling shows to convince the public that it was DC, direct current, that people wanted. Okay? There were some DC power stations in the Pascack Valley. The problem with DC current, and Edison knew this, is you can't transmit it over long distances. So what that meant was every town had to have its own power station and be wired back to that power station, and of course you had to buy your DC generation equipment from Edison. When Niagara Falls was built and alternating current was installed there, it became very obvious that alternating current generated by natural forces that could be transmitted 60 miles effectively meant that not every town needed its own power generation. So that ended that. But for a while, and it was actually quite a while, people weren't sure whether electricity was going to catch on or not. There are neighborhoods in the Pascack Valley that were wired for DC and had DC for a while. It wasn't like it is now. The power poles are on the streets now. Back then, the power poles were run down through the backyards, between the backs of the properties. And there was usually a line that went to a garage or an outbuilding, and then there was the line that went to the house. And they were concerned about safety. There are towns in New Jersey, Glen Ridge, for instance, that still has, it's not direct current anymore, it's alternating current, but they still have the distribution systems in the backyards of houses. They have the poles, and the lines run from the backyard. There were, up until Superstorm Sandy, there were some shore towns that were wired that way too. And of course, that gets the poles off the streets, but introduces a whole slew of other problems when you go to try to maintain the lines. You have to cross people's properties. Trees are a problem. So moving them to the streets was what ultimately they decided to do. Of course, I believe they should be underground, but that costs a fortune. So a lot of the houses were wired from the backyards with pole systems that ran down the rear property lines. The DC was great. It was on, and strangely enough, at the end of the day, when the generator master went home, he shut it off.
What?
You only had electric power during the day.
Oh, goodness.
But this was also around the time when alternating current became clear. Yes, sir, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm often wondering, maybe you know the answer, when they dug the holes in the street to dig the gas lines, why didn't they just put the electric lines right next to them? It's the same amount of digging.
The gas lines went in much earlier than the electric lines did.
Did they?
And they also were concerned, because you got to remember, this is new technology. They didn't know what would happen to a wire buried in the ground. They weren't sure about whether it would hold up or whether it could electrocute people walking above it on the ground. There were all kinds of safety concerns. But my point about the electric and gas is that for a long time, homes in the Pascack Valley were built with both electric wiring and gas lines in the walls. So you would have gas lighting and electric lighting. My house was like that. My dining room had a ceiling fixture that when I went to put a ceiling fan in, I discovered the old connection for the gas chandelier. And again, they did this because they couldn't be sure. See, the power works. The electric works.
Because you're not showing slides anymore to turn on the lights.
Okay, that's fine. I'm sorry. I'll make more slides next time. I wasn't really sure how long I was going to go. So that was the big thing with electric power. So now power, AC power is accepted form of power. It's generated by power stations that can transmit up to 60 miles away. So that means the stations can be up to 120 miles apart, and then they interconnect, and that's our electric grid that we have today.
How old is your house?
My house was built in 1895. But you find this up into even as late as World War I that they were building in both because they both were available. And with Edison going around electrocuting things, it was a scary thing. All right, let's talk a little. I talked about the heat. I talked about the electric. Insulation. There wasn't any. There was no insulation. I've heard some people say that they would crumple up newspapers, put them inside the walls. That's a very bad idea. Even people back then knew that that was a bad idea from a fire standpoint. So very often, the lath and plaster was an empty cavity, and then you had the exterior siding. Was no insulation. Insulation came in just before World War II, and then of course after World War II, they started putting a minimal amount in, and then of course after the oil crises, they started to say, oh, maybe we should put more and more and more insulation in. So very often you'll see older homes in Pascack Valley have holes. Sometimes you'll see them in the attic stairs. There's a hole with a plug. And if you have your siding redone, they take a section up, you'll see a plug. They drilled holes in the outside of the house, and they blew in insulation to add insulation. The problem with that is the insulation they were using at the time would settle And where you need the insulation is really at the top of the wall. You lose most of your heat through the roof, not necessarily through the wall so much. So as the insulation settled, it opened up that cavity again, and but anything's better than nothing. So that's where you see insulation. Nowadays, we have all kinds of insulation materials. We use fiberglass, which is readily available. There's also spray foam. There's open and closed cell spray foam insulation materials. There's new installations that are about to come out as a result of the space program and the space shuttle. They have some really very expensive materials, but as they send them into mass production, they'll come down. Right now, an inch of fiberglass is about an R3. An inch of spray foam, closed cell spray foam, which I use a lot now, is about an R7. So there's a big improvement there. But they have materials now that are not yet available that are up to R40 for 1 inch of material. So they're making huge advances. It's just they need to get the costs down. Let's talk about plumbing. 1850s. There ain't none. So you have your house. And in your kitchen, you have probably a Hoosier cabinet with a dry sink, which was something that you went out to the well, you pumped the water, you brought it in. The dry sink, it's called the dry sink because doesn't have running water to it. And then that water you would do, like a regular sink, and it would drain through a hole in the bottom into a bucket, and then you would get rid of that dirty water. That was the kitchen. Inside they used, for lack of a better term, they used chamber pots and then outhouses. Now, outhouses are essentially latrines. You dig a hole in the ground, and you build a little building over it for comfort, and you use it until it fills up. Then you cover it over, and then you move over and you dig another hole. Now that's fine in 1850, 1860, when we've only got 14,000 people in the whole county. The problem is that when you start to develop more, and you start to have houses closer together, there's two reasons why you have to be careful. One is your outhouse has to be far away from your well. You don't want cross-contamination. As properties got smaller, that became harder to do. And of course, your neighbor is going to put his outhouse on his property right next to your well. And you did the same thing to your other neighbor. So this is a problem. It's a huge problem. Outbreaks of disease, what was causing it? A lot of times it was caused by this. So they developed, and at the same time they had clay tile pipe, and they had some rudimentary piping, but it was still mainly outhouses. As the population increases, you get into the 1880s and 1890s, you start to see inventions like the toilet. And the toilet was revolutionary. I mean, it's just like the cell phone is today. It allowed people to have this in their house, and then they could connect it by pipe. In some cases, the pipe was clay tile. In some cases, the pipe was cast iron. Now we have PVC materials. But the toilet can be inside the house with water brought in under pressure. They put water lines in the streets under pressure, so you can tap into that, you can have running water, and you can have a toilet, and you don't have to go out to the outhouse. But they had no plumbing codes yet. So the toilet would go down a pipe, out the basement wall, into the yard, into what they used to call a cesspool. Now a cesspool is really no different than an outhouse. It's a big tank, usually they dig a big hole, they line it with concrete block, they put a lid on it, so they could clean it out periodically because they weren't going to dig another one. And the effluent would go in there. And they would clean it out. The honey dipper, as they would say, would clean it out periodically. But the effluent was not being sufficiently treated to prevent this contamination of wells and other things. So this is where you start to see plumbing codes come in for health safety reasons and outlying cesspools. At this point, you start to see septic systems. And the way a septic system works is the toilet flushes, the water goes down the pipe, it goes out into the yard, it goes into a smaller version of a cesspool, which is called the distribution box. In that distribution box, it's treated with enzymes and bacteria that actually consume the dangerous parts of the waste. And that actually happens fairly quickly. Then from there, the distribution box was connected to what they called a tile field. And they had tile pipe with spaces between. The effluent would come out of the distribution box, flow into those pipes, and then slowly dissipate into the ground. And that was a huge step forward. That helped a lot. And as Pascack Valley got even more developed, and we started to see lots go from half acre to quarter acre or smaller, septic systems themselves start to become a problem again because you've got so many of them in such close proximity that it starts to become a health safety issue. And that's when you start to see centralized sewers being put in. Westwood got its sewers in 1924. That was early. It was early. But it allowed Westwood residents to connect into the sewers and get rid of their cess. In some cases, some people were connecting from cesspools directly into sewers. They didn't do the septic systems at all. And it was a big public health concern. You saw in a lot of towns of Bergen County. I grew up in Closter, and we didn't get sewers in Closter until 1973. We were on quarter-acre lots with septic systems, and the septic systems would very often overflow. And I can remember as a child, in the summers, it stank. But in 1973, the county came in and ran the lines and connected up. And Old Tappan only got their sewers about a decade ago, parts of Old Tappan. Yeah. So, right, they were on septics up until only a few years ago. So most of the area is now on the centralized sewer. So we can all rest easy, don't have to. But that's what makes higher density development possible. It's plumbing. Yes, sir.
Where did Westwood's effluent go to?
You know what? I don't know. They were one of the first to get it. I don't know whether they processed it locally or whether it was connected to a place further away. I tend to think it was processed locally. But I don't know the answer to that question. I have to find out now that you've asked me. I've got to find out. But they did get the sewers in most of the streets around the downtown area. It was 1924. You can see the manhole covers actually say Westwood, New Jersey Sewer, 1924. And then, like I said, towns like Closter and Old Tappan didn't get them until only a few decades ago. But without that, we could not live in a densely populated area. We would poison each other. And this happens in third world countries all the time. So that's the issue of plumbing. Some houses were built, obviously if you had an outhouse, you didn't have plumbing in the house. So when these things came along in the 1890s and so into the turn of the century, people wanted to add plumbing into their houses. A lot of the bungalows, because they were straight run, one room after another, they added a small addition up the back, and that was a bathroom. It's usually a 5x7 area, and it had a tub shower, a toilet, and a sink, and that was the bathroom for the bungalow. And a pipe went down and went either into a septic or into the street. One of the ways you can tell in your house, if you were on a septic before, is you go in the basement, does the pipe go out the back of your house or out the front? If it goes out the back, at one time you may have been connected to a septic, and the pipe was rerouted from the back around the side of your house out to the street. And that was done a lot. But you're talking about cutting plumbing into a house that's already constructed. This happened to me. When I redid my kitchen, I removed the ceiling in the kitchen and discovered that there was no plumbing in the house when the house was constructed. And this is 1895. No plumbing. It was a water well and a cesspool because I found the cesspool and had it filled in. It was enormous. I could have lived in it. I looked down in a hole. It was like I thought I was going to see the devil waving up at me. Very dangerous to have a void like that under your. Now it hadn't been in use for some time. It was completely drained. In the bottom was what was left of 100-year-old, you know what. But it was just, I was amazed at how immensely large it was.
Is that where sinkholes come from?
Probably, yeah. Some cases, yes. And that's why we have to have the septic tanks. Even the septic tanks, even though they're smaller, they can cause some of that. But I had mine filled in. But people would cut the plumbing in. Now you're cutting the plumbing into a house that's already there. So you're chopping it up. And you're cutting through floor beams and you're cutting through walls because you want to conceal these things. You don't want to see the pipes. They had chopped up my house so badly, there was less than an inch of material holding up my bathtub. I didn't know this. Didn't know this at the time. But once the ceiling came down and I was looking at this, of course the contractor called me immediately and said, you got to see this. I said, son of a gun, they cut this plumbing stack into the house after it was built. The house had steam heat, but no plumbing when it was built. And this happened throughout the Pascack Valley. So there's always little nice surprises that you find when you do a little remodeling. But cast iron pipe, my pipe went out the back, around the side, out to the street. So that meant that the plumbing had to have been put in after 1895, but before 1924. Because if it was after 1824, they would have gone out the front. So there was the cesspool, which I located, and then, and the other way I know this is there was a stack in the back, there was another stack in the side. There were multiple sewer stacks exiting the basement of my house. Normally you don't do that. You collect them all into one, and you have one pipe going out of the house. So these were the clues that I found. See, the old house is talking. Actually, at that point, I thought the old house was cursing at me. But that's what plumbing codes, first they had more regional plumbing codes, and then they had more specific plumbing codes like we have today that didn't get enacted until the late 20s, believe it or not. And that's when your fixtures had to be connected properly, there had to be proper vents, the pipes had to be certain sizes, and there had to be inspections. And plumbing inspection and plumbing installations are one of the first things that required inspections in the building codes. Because it literally was a life and death thing. It was a life safety issue. Because this stuff can be dangerous if it's not disposed of properly. Okay. All right. Now, we talked about electricity. After electricity started to catch on, that opens the door to things like refrigeration and air conditioning, things that people never had before. Refrigeration equipment was invented in the late 1800s, wasn't perfected until later on, but electricity, wide distribution of electricity gave movie theaters an edge because they could be air conditioned and you could go to the movies in the summer to get away from the heat. And if you look at movie theater advertising from the 20s and 30s, you will see that they advertised fully air-conditioned, and that's why. And that's how they got people into the movies. Not that the movies weren't good, but it was a place where you could go to escape the heat. But before we had refrigeration and refrigerators, there were ice boxes. Now, I've seen a few ice boxes, antique ice boxes. Oh, by the way, this is back to the outhouse for a second. When I was 6 years old, my parents took me to the Catskills. We had relatives who lived in the Catskills on a farm. They had an outhouse. I actually got to use an outhouse at the age of 6 years old. This was back in the late 60s. So I had a first-hand experience of what that was like. They were still using outhouses up there because the land was not populated, so you could do it. It was fun. All right, now back to refrigeration and ice boxes. People had ice boxes, which were insulated boxes that had ice in them, and the iceman would deliver ice. Now, the next question is, well, without electricity, without refrigeration, where did the ice come from?
They made them.
All around the Pascack Valley, there were ice manufacturing operations. They would dam up some of the smaller waterways, and they would create these very shallow ponds that they would keep very clean. And then, of course, out the other end of the pond, it would flow back into whatever water course it was. In the winter, they would freeze 6-8 inches thick, and they would periodically cut the ice into blocks and load it into ice houses. Now, an ice house was a big shed that was insulated with straw and whatever animal pelts, whatever kind of fur, wool, anything. They insulated, the walls were very thick. The ice that they made in the winter would last all year long because of the insulated ice houses. So the Iceman could bring you ice for your ice box so that you could have some refrigeration to keep foods preserved so that you weren't dying from food spoilage. Once we had the electricity, oh, by the way, there was an ice harvesting operation at the corner of Lake Street and Broadway in Westwood, where the car wash is now, where Timmy's is, oddly enough, ironically enough, across the street from Fritz Diedel's ice skating rink. And this is why Lake Street is called Lake Street in Westwood, because there were these lakes that they harvested ice. And they were deliberately designed to be shallow and wide so that when they froze, they could harvest the ice, and then they'd freeze again, and they'd harvest more, and they would just do this as long as the temperature allowed, and that ice would last all year long because of the way they stored it through the summers, which still amazes me now. So now we come to electricity, and then you start to see refrigerators, and the Iceman goeth. You don't need the Iceman anymore. And this is how homes became more comfortable. And then, of course, with refrigeration, you see the air conditioning, and you see central air conditioning starts to take the place of planting trees and having porches. And, of course, now people can have these huge windows that let the sun blast in the summer, and then they spend a fortune with their air conditioning equipment getting the heat out so that they can be comfortable. I really believe we have completely lost touch with nature. We go from the air-conditioned house, to the air-conditioned car, to the air-conditioned workplace, to the air-conditioned car, back to the air-conditioned home. Now, my house does not have central air conditioning. I did not want to rip the walls open in order to put ducts in. There are high-velocity systems that I could have put in. What I did was I have I have 3 through-the-wall units in the main bedrooms so that we can sleep at night. And I have 1 unit that we keep in the kitchen, keep the kitchen cool. But because of the window design, and because of the porch that sweeps the south and the west side, the heat of the sun never makes it into the house. Even if I didn't put the air conditioning on at all, the house is still cool inside, even on the hottest summer days. So we only use the air conditioning very sparingly. Even in the hottest summers, we might have a bill of $150 for a whole 3,000 square foot house. So it's a matter of having knowledge of nature and understanding the way things work, and to look back as to the way things were done before all these, quote, modern conveniences, so-called modern conveniences are saving us from all this discomfort that never really existed in the first place because people weren't uncomfortable. They lived with the seasons. I was going to get into fire protection, but I talked about gypsum. Basically, to wrap it up, I just want to say that the rail line coming into the Pascack Valley in 1870 was a life-altering event for everyone in the valley, and it allowed for the development that we see today. And that was the major catalyst, and that affected everything. But most of all, it affected how homes were constructed, and it affected how people felt about their home. It just changed the attitude of everyone. I don't know whether it's changed for the better or not. I'll leave that to all of you. But I look at some of these old homes, and I've been in hundreds, if not thousands of them, and I see the care and the craftsmanship that went into a lot of them, and it just makes me think that people think differently about these houses now than they did at that time. And I guess that's the conclusion of my presentation. I thank you for listening, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Sir?
South of Virginia, the houses have very nice, like panel-type roofing.
Yeah.
Sheet panel-type roofing. I don't see any of that in Bergen County, only asphalt.
Just describe the material. It's a sheet, is it metal?
Yeah, the sheet metal roofing panels, that's it. A vertical line.
Right, that's a standing seam metal roof. We had those, it was available in the area, but the materials that you see around you now here in the Pascack Valley were less expensive.
Less expensive.
And that's what drives a lot of things. People will tend to use the material that is less expensive.
They're not prohibited by building code?
No. Oh, metal roofs, I use metal roofs on houses now even. We use them as an accent sometimes.
Are they a lot more expensive than asphalt?
Not anymore. They used to be a lot more, but not anymore. Now they're starting to come down in price, and they are very attractive. They also have the added effect of allowing snow to slide off, which can be very helpful. And it's not always great, but you know, the snow slides into the gutter or the gutter off your house. That's not so great. But if it's done properly with some thought, metal roofs can be beautiful. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question about the gas, the lighting
Mhm.
that you spoke about. Is that natural gas, just like our stove would be?
Yes.
And the lighting would be a similar flame?
Yes. It was a flame that had an adjustment on it, like the stove adjustment. It was a small valve, and you could make the flame higher or lower, and it had glass around it, very much like an oil lamp used to have. And that would keep the flame from burning the house down. And it worked well for a while.
It didn't require any kind of, like a fluorescent mantle, like
They were different.
with the lighting?
There were different lighting designs. You know, natural gas lighting doesn't produce a very bright light, which is why it didn't last long. But the pipe comes out of the wall. There was usually a medallion. Usually you'll see medallion on the ceiling, too. They did that as a decorative way to cover up the cracks in the plaster when they had the pipe penetrating through. They would have a decorative medallion, and then there would be a pipe out, would be a valve on it, and the fixture would attach to that.
My grandfather's house, it was rural, had gas lighting, carbide.
You mean there was a tank, like a propane tank outside? Yeah, that was another way.
Acid dripping on the stone.
Made the
Give off
gas.
the gas.
Yeah. Yeah, there are all kinds of methods. A lot of times the method depended on the location. If the materials to facilitate that method were available readily, then that community would default to that because, again, of cost and for convenience.
Well, to this day, you drive through Glen Ridge, there's still have street gas lines.
Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of cities in the United States that still have gas lamps in certain sections. It's a beautiful kind of a light, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What kind of fuel was your steam heat?
Well, when I got to it, it was natural gas. But at some point in the past, it was an oil. There were oil tanks.
At 1890?
No.
No.
The boiler that's in my house now, that's connected to the steam
What was the
system.
original?
I don't know. From looking at the connections, I would tend to think that it was probably, I know it was not wood and it was not coal. I do not have a coal chute. There's no area in my house that would be used to house coal.
Yeah.
So I would think it was probably oil from the beginning. And they had oil deliveries. I mean, Comfort Coal before it burned down in Westwood delivered coal. They also had oil. Gas came through the street. The oil was cheaper for a time. A lot of people went with the oil even though they could use natural gas. And that's all I know. I can't really tell from looking at it what it was originally, but that would be my guess. Yes, ma'am?
This is related to what you were saying before, that you said that there were no maps from about 1840, before 1840, because it was sparsely populated here.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not exactly from here, so wasn't the land suitable for farming here, that the people were living here in this part of the...
It was suitable for farming, and that's what they were using a lot of it for.
But you said there was no maps, there was no...
There were no maps of the individual towns. Pascack Valley consists of 8 towns that were once one town. And there were farms, but they didn't farm all of the land. They farmed parts of the land. So it was never a case where it was so great to farm here that they cut all the trees down and farmed everywhere. That wasn't the case. So they couldn't support a population that was enough, that would require them to make maps of the individual sections of the Pascack Valley. But you will find maps of Bergen County, you'll find old maps of New Jersey, but it's just, there were so few people. I mean, it really is amazing to think that there were only 14,000 people in the entire county in 1850.
One last question I saw in the back there, I thought.
Sir?
Yes?
Somebody?
You're going to ask?
Yes.
You said your house has heat
Yes.
way back, but it
Yeah.
has no pumps.
Yes.
So they get the water,
Where they get the water? From the well.
carry it in,
Yeah.
fill the tank.
Yeah.
On and off.
This is what they did. The steam heat, and again, sometimes it can be hard to tell whether the pipes are cut in afterwards. The thing with steam heat and the pipes is they didn't want to conceal those pipes. They left them exposed to the room because the pipes would heat up and transfer some of that heat into the rooms. So they didn't bury them inside the walls, especially exterior walls, because you'd be generating heat and you'd be heating the town instead of your house. So they would put them inside the wall, about 4 or 5 inches off the wall, usually in a corner. Sometimes they would enclose them. A lot of times they didn't. They just left them exposed because you got heat that way. It was part of how the system worked. So because of that, it can be sometimes hard to tell whether it was cut in later or whether it was part of the original. From looking at the subfloor and the hardwood flooring, it appears to me that the steam heat system was in the house when it was constructed, because there seems to be some logical consideration for the installation and for the locations. And I have found locations where there used to be radiators where they were removed and a plug was put in. Unlike the plumbing, which was chocked in like somebody with a samurai sword and created a very dangerous situation. Of course, I was unaware of it because it was covered up.
Bill, thank you for coming today. We learned so much.
My pleasure.
How's your voice held up?